Welcome back. This is week 5, lecture 2, Humanism and Reform. And on the slide, PowerPoint slide, it says Introduction, the Problem of the Renaissance. And that is because humanism is always associated with the Renaissance. The problem is, what was the Renaissance? And I'm not going to be going into a great deal of detail here in terms of the Renaissance. I'm scheduled, I believe, to teach a course on the Renaissance, History B 353, in the fall, I believe it is. But anyway, the point here is the relationship between the so-called Renaissance and humanism, which I'll be talking about a great deal today and focusing on, and then the Reformation. So often the Renaissance and the Reformation are seen as the two sources of modernity. My view is that the Renaissance was anything but this gets into interpreting what was going on. The Renaissance, as so many concepts we have and events that we consider to be events in history, like the fall of Rome, was a historiographical context or historiographical term. The Renaissance, it was created by Jacob Burckhardt in 1860s, I think it was, when he published 2 volumes on the civilization of the Italian Renaissance in Italy. Civilization of Italy and the Italian Renaissance, or something like that. Anyway, I forget exactly what the title was. Burckhardt was a Swiss historian, and this became a classic work. And it is a classic work. It's a brilliant classic work. The problem is that scholars since Burckhardt, especially Renaissance scholars, have taken Burckhardt and his interpretation as a description of historical reality. Burckhardt, too, gave us the term the Dark Ages, basically, because he saw it as a rebirth of learning taking place in Italy in the 14th century. And note, previously, he has this great line. I mean, I hate it as a medievalist. This great line is like, there was a veil hanging over the darkness of Europe until the Renaissance came and lifted the veil and let the sunlight in to what had been just darkness. And that is absolute ahistorical nonsense, even though it was a brilliant insight at the time. But scholars have taken his interpretation as a description of what was really going on. Now, there was a sense at the time, in this 14th century, later 14th century, on into the 15th century, of Italian scholars themselves, in a sense, feeling that they were affecting a rebirth, a renaissance. That's what the term Renaissance means. It means a rebirth, a renaissance, a rebirth of classical culture. That would almost be like taking one side of any political debate today and saying that side is right and that is reality and the other side is just wrong. Meaning it is taking how they conceived of themselves, which is an important point to make. It's important that they felt that way. And saying that that's what actually was going on. And just as one indication, I'll be talking more about this later, the Italian humanists, as they were called, and I'll be addressing that term too, because that's a very important term and also very misunderstood usually. The Italian humanists wanted to imitate classical models. And part of that was then we are going to develop a new way of writing, a new hand, called humanist hand, because this is before printing still, but to keep in mind. And we're going to copy classical writing. Well, they weren't copying classical writing. What they did was copy Carolingian minuscule. Now, Carolingian minuscule was based on Roman half uncial. Talking about how handwriting is made, how the letters are formed and everything. So they were copying and imitating a copy of classical writing, but not Roman writing itself. Now, I'll be addressing more of these issues throughout this lecture. And I should let you know that as a medievalist, in many ways, that I am biased against the Renaissance. Um, Very interestingly, in 1924, I think it was 1924, Charles Homer Haskins, who was an American medievalist, published what was a very controversial book at the time called The Renaissance of the 12th Century, in which he argued that many of the developments that Burckhardt identified as novelties or newnesses of the 14th century were already there in the 12th century. Now, this whole concept of the 12th century Renaissance, or as I use the term usually, medieval Renaissance, because it's a bit broader than just the 12th century, led to what was called the revolt of the medievalists against the Renaissance scholars, who claimed that everything modern and good started with the Renaissance. It was in many ways reading back into historical developments, what was going on in the later 19th century on into the 20th century. That was the case too with the concept of humanism and secularism. This idea of humanism being against the church was ridiculous if we see it as being against religion or Christianity. There was no humanist at all who was against Christianity. They were very strong proponents of Christianity. They didn't question it. Yeah, they were critical of the clergy and the hierarchy a bit, but so that was part of the time. And so in that sense, too, they were part of what I've been called the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. And it was a distinct development during this period of approximately 1300 to 1600, chronologically, but then it became a qualitative definition so that we have Renaissance taking place at the same time as the later Middle Ages. But they were one of the same. So that is why I want to stress a little bit this conceptual problem when we're addressing the question of the Renaissance and Reformation, and then the place of humanism and reform within that understanding of how do we approach it and understand what's going on. Now, I'm not going to be asking you to compare and contrast the Renaissance and Reformation and evaluate the relative contribution to the origins of modernity. I'm not going to do that. Because for me, the Renaissance was a particular development within the later Middle Ages. And to an extent, contributed to the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, as distinct from, as I'll be talking about, Luther's Reformation, and then on into the various different patterns of Reformation of the 16th century as we go forward. So I just want to bring your attention to that as also as what I'm talking about today, and I'll be again talking and explicitly addressing the definition of humanism and humanists. That this is an important topic to bring up. But we need to understand how to approach it historically and not read back into the historical developments, modern assumptions and conceptualizations. Now, that was a long way of introducing the problem of the Renaissance. But if we just look at it as traditionally has been a qualitative interpretation rather than a development during this almost quantitative chronological period, that is a place to start. And we need to look at it within the broader context because, too, it was Renaissance and later Middle Ages were going on all at the same time, especially when we start talking about the Northern Renaissance as scholars started talking about later on. So I'm going to leave the debate between the Renaissance scholars and the medievalists here and now. I'm not going to try to solve that. I've been clear in terms of where which side I fall on and defend, because that's still going on. And largely, scholars who are Renaissance scholars really don't pay much attention to the Middle Ages, and scholars who are medievalists don't pay a lot of attention to the Renaissance. And it leads to a misunderstanding on both sides, basically. And the scholars of the Reformation pursue what their interests and don't really know what to do with either, so to speak. And one of the big questions is, was Luther a humanist? And that's something I'll be addressing shortly as well. And what was the effect of humanism on the Reformation? And so how could that be a concept that would work together? Well, I think you'll see when I get there, because humanism was basically just the teachers of the teaching of the humanities, and the humanists were teachers of the humanities, the humani or the studia humanitatis, and as such, they focused on language and literature and history, Greek, Latin, and Hebrew north of the Alps, Greek and Latin, classical Latin in Italy. I know I'm kind of all over the place here, and don't worry, I'll kind of come back to the PowerPoint slides and try to stay more on focus and more on topic. But it is kind of a mess, and that's what I wanted to, in some ways, present to you, the mess that this concept of the Renaissance and the relationship between the Renaissance and Reformation and what that has to do with humanism has been. There's little question that there was an impact of humanism on the Reformation, and I'll be addressing that shortly. But what did that really mean? It's not an anti-Christian movement in any way, shape, or form. It's completely different from what today is referred to as secular humanism or just humanism. It has nothing to do with Renaissance humanism. But I'll be coming back to that. So that I hope that kind of sets the stage. And if you're confused, don't worry about it, because the whole point is this is a confusing concept to kind of wrap our minds around when we're approaching this period and developments within this period from approximately 1300 to 1600. How do we describe it? In some ways, I've addressed that before. Is like how do we describe what we observe in the sources? And so often how we describe something affects how we understand it. And the issue is to then allow the sources, the extant artifacts, to question our understanding and to problematize our understanding. Always asking, am I understanding this correctly? Am I describing this correctly? If so, on what basis? If not, on what basis? That's what we always need to be asking ourselves. So that being said, and that's why we're doing the textual analysis, how do these texts, these artifacts, force us to reevaluate our assumptions and pre-understandings, or prejudgments, as Gadamer would call them, or did call them, prejudgments, our prejudices about what we're observing and studying. That is part of the historical problem that we have. It's not just here we are and we're looking at this. It's how does this all fit in with what we bring to it, and how does that help and shape and almost determine what it is that we observe, and why can't we say, okay, what we observe is questioning what we bring to it? Question. And on what basis can we say something about the past? That is what all of this is getting at. So that being said, and my apologies, but again, if this is confusing, that was almost by intent. No, I don't really mean bad. I don't mean to, but I want you to have some insight into the complexity and of the theme and the problems involved with it, that we can't simply reduce it to a simple, straightforward definition. This is the Renaissance, this is the Reformation, and this is how they worked together. That is a fallacy. So, that being said, let's dive into it and look at what this really was, and how we approach it and understand it. And if there was something that was common and agreed upon in terms of the Renaissance, it was the call to return to the sources, which is in some ways what I'm doing in this course. We need to return to the sources, which in Latin is ad fontes. Fonte is the font, or the source of a river, the font of a river, the font of water, whatever we want to call it. It's also the fountain, okay, but it's the font is the source. And the call to go back to the sources. almost defined this movement because it was saying, okay, we have this classical tradition, but instead of reading it in bits and pieces, instead of reading it in anthologies, so to speak, we need to actually go back and read the sources themselves in the original. Not just the translations, not just the snippets, but actually read the sources. And we need to find the actual manuscripts. And humanists did come up with new manuscripts of works that they thought had been lost, but that were found. And the whole point was to pursue classical models. And by classical here, I mean those of ancient Greece and Rome. And at first, predominantly Rome, and then later the Greek was added to it. And to say, okay, how can we use these models, these classical models? And in some ways, and this is part of my argument, that the Renaissance actually killed Latin. We might say, well, wait a minute, I thought you were just saying how they were going back to the sources and reading it in the original, and they loved Latin. They did love Latin. They loved classical Latin. But they also killed it as a living language. Why? Because for the humanists, again, I haven't defined them, but I'll get back to that in a second, there were models, and Cicero became the model for Latin prose because he was seen, in some ways, at the time, historically, he was seen at it in his own time. But certainly from this point on, the Renaissance on, he was seen as the greatest author of Latin prose ever to have lived. And then Virgil was seen as the greatest author of Latin poetry ever to have lived. So the whole point that the Renaissance scholars were making was that we should imitate these classical models, Cicero and Virgil. And what was not Ciceronian, or what was not Virgilian, was of a lesser standard and lesser quality. By concretizing the basis of Latinity, they killed it. It'd be like saying, okay, who is the greatest? Who has been the greatest author of English ever to have lived? And most people, I'm not saying everyone, and the whole point is not to debate this question, but most people would say it's probably Shakespeare. Okay, well, if Shakespeare is the greatest author of English, we should imitate Shakespeare. And anything that is not Shakespearean is of a lesser quality. So we need to speak Shakespearean English. We need to write Shakespearean English. And if you don't or can't, you're lesser. We look down on you because Shakespeare is the standard. That's what they did with Cicero and Virgil. And that would then kill English because it says we don't need to have a developed, ongoing, evolving language. We should go back to this form here. Now, there are positives and negatives to that, obviously, and I think there's also a negative to it, and that is that it kills it. But also the positive is it focuses on textual criticism and language. It really gets back to saying we need to look at these sources, these texts, these manuscripts, and analyze them, also for the language. Now that is kind of the foundation of this movement that has been termed humanism. And I may have said this before, but it is the ism is always a 19th century German creation. So we go from the humanists to humanism. And the question is, what does it really mean? Is it really a thing, humanism, or in German, Humanismus? Or is it a description of what certain scholars did who were considered to be humanists? Now, the issue of the humanists, as I were already saying, was made far too much of, were simply people who pursued and followed the studia humanitatis, the study of the humanities. So if you were teaching the humanities, you were by definition a humanist. Just as if you were teaching law, you were a legist. And just as if you were teaching the liberal arts, you were an artist. Not in the sense of I paint and I draw and I sculpt. No, but in terms of I'm teaching the liberal arts. I teach the humanities. Now, the humanities, basically literature, history, ethics, politics, were not part of the educational curriculum. They're not part of the university curriculum. They're outside the educational structure. So there's almost an implicit critique of the educational system. And that is where this kind of ties in. And it's saying that the educational approach to education as such is wrong. So we need to reform it and effect a rebirth of classical education. That's what this Renaissance was about, this renaissance of classical models. We need to imitate classical models. Whether we're doing so or not is another question, but that is what we conceptually for ourselves think we should be doing. And we need to teach these subjects. Now I have on a later slide, I'll get there in terms of how this all plays out to illustrate it. But it is an approach that was different from what was going on in the universities. It was outside of the universities, the Studia Humanitatis. Scholars have argued, I think very persuasively, that the origins of this educational movement, scholarly movement, was in the late 13th century Italian city-states based on diplomacy, because rather than logic, rhetoric was important. Rhetoric is the study. We have so dismissed rhetoric as being, mere rhetoric. But from the classical education on, rhetoric was the means of persuasion. It was what you needed to study to become a lawyer. And Augustine was a teacher of rhetoric. And the whole basis of classical education was based on rhetoric. How do we persuade? And that is very important if you're going to be a politician, if you're going to be a lawyer. How do you persuade people? And that approach in terms of diplomacy, in terms of law, in the Italian city-states in the later 13th century, led to called city secretaries going back and saying, we could be more effective if we do it this way. And that then developed more general views of we can imitate classical models, and there's a practical application of that in our diplomacy, in our law, and that we can do it better, and we can persuade people and be more successful than trying to beat them over the head with logical arguments and so. And so that is kind of what this is all about. A new educational approach, new scholarly approach based on classical models. At first predominantly Latin, but then later on Greek. And it was based on the Studia Humanitatis, the study of the humanities, which was distinct from and outside of the traditional educational and university curriculum as it had developed from the late 12th on into the 13th century and thereafter. So that is what we're kind of talking about here. And here, then the next slide, we go to the Italian humanism and Northern humanism, because that has been seen, modern scholars have made this distinction. Because in some ways, this new educational approach in Italy spread, and it spread north of the Alps. As it did so, it developed a bit differently, and also is a bit later. So in the north of the Alps, the focus is not just on Greek and Latin, but also on Hebrew. The idea of the threefold trilingual man, the whole question of did women have a renaissance is a whole question. The title of a famous article by Joan Wallace Scott. Did a woman have a renaissance? And basically she said, no, they didn't. But it's a whole separate issue and study. But it was an issue of, again, language and importance. Now, it has been taken as also saying that the Northern Renaissance was more Christian and the Italian Renaissance was more secular. That is, in my view, a completely false dichotomy. As I already mentioned, we have critics of the clergy of the institutional church in the north as well as in Italy. And there is not a single individual in Italy or in the north who was critical of Christianity. They were critical of how Christianity was being preached and taught and implemented in the politics, the institutional politics of the church. And so there was no sense of a conflict between theology and religion and humanities, or one and the same. And when we have Greek and Latin, now Greek really didn't take off even in Italy until after the Council of Basel. We have Greek scholars, I think I talked about that, coming to the West, and they ended up staying. So Greek, as we go into the 15th century later on, becomes more important. They start having centers of Greek added to the issue of Latin. And north of the Alps, that was the case too. Now, it also then started being used to interpret the Bible, because it's like all of a sudden we can apply these same literary standards and textual criticism to the biblical text. Now, this has been going on in some ways also in the 12th century. Peter Abelard approached the biblical interpretation very similarly, and said we can understand the biblical text just as we understand classical texts. So there is a difference in what was going on in the 12th century, but it wasn't like completely unheard of that was an approach. Now, one of the issues that I have up here, the Devotio Moderna, and I know Lindbergh talks about this. I mentioned it, I think, in chapter 1 of my Luther book, is tied into this, is because in northern Germany and the lowlands, what later became the Netherlands, in the 15th century, a movement developed that was called the Devotio Moderna, the modern devotion. And it was a means of saying we can live a more religious life without having to join a religious order. So it's this idea of this spread of almost a monastic life, but beyond the walls of the monastery. And in some ways, my guy, Jordan Quedlinburg, was instrumental in the development of this, because he argued that everyone should be a religious. Every Christian should be religious, not just the monks. And he says that you don't have to join a religious order to be religious. You can also take a personal vow to God. And in the north, in Germany and the Netherlands, there began to be lay groups who also, some of them started living together in groups, brothers and sisters of the common life, as they were called, devoted to living a Christian life within society. They kept their jobs, they kept their families and everything else, but yet they had this special devotion to live out their Christian faith in community, and a new dedication to to living the Christian life. So this ties into humanism, because part of that modern devotion, even though this is a major question of how this all related, was that they established schools, because they thought, if we're going to really study what it means to be a religious, we need to study the scriptures. We need to study the Christian traditions. That's, after all, what monks and friars were doing. And so they did establish some of these schools also for elementary education, and adopted, not completely, but partly, humanist curricula, meaning the humanities. And so there's began to be this association between the modern devotion, or the Devotio Moderna, and Northern humanism, as distinct from more secular Italian humanism. But that is a false distinction. No, there was not a movement of the modern devotion in Italy, but there were analogous aspects And the whole point is at this time, especially within this age of crisis, as I tried to portray it, the question of what do we have to do to be religious was very broadly spread and was a general question that was being asked. How do we be Christian? What does that mean, living a Christian life, when everything seemed to be going to hell after the famine and the plague and the wars that were going on, and then the schism? What is happening? How do we deal with this? Was a general development of the time. One solution was the Devotion Moderna. It was not the only one. It was not the solution placed in opposition to other possibilities. And the need to try to persuade people to live a truly religious life, as Jordan argued in his sermons, was then also a means of using humanism, using history and literature and persuasion and rhetoric, because the better you can persuade someone in preaching, the more effective your preaching will be. And so rhetoric is not just the law and the politics and diplomacy, it was also then partly with preaching, began to say, oh, we need to persuade people. And I have up there here rhetoric, the art of persuasion. And this became, in Italy and the Italian Renaissance, but also then translating it to the North, a phrase that it is better to do the good than to know the truth. Because doing the good is what it's all about. How many of you, for example, do things that you know are bad for you? I do, constantly. Well, I'm not going to go off on that, explain all of that, but I do and have. I think we all do. But isn't that insane? Why should we choose to do something that we know is bad for us? We have the knowledge. We have the knowledge. And we choose to ignore it. We don't follow it. So the whole point here is that just that point. It's better to actually do the good than to know the truth, because if you're doing the good, it doesn't matter if you know the truth or not. But if you just know the truth and are not doing the good, what value is that knowledge? That was the humanist critique against the traditional educational curriculum and programs that was focused on knowing the truth and ignored putting that into practice in terms of doing the good. There is that aspect that is there. Logic is great for knowing the truth. Rhetoric is essential for persuading people to do the good. That is then this combination. What does it mean to be a good citizen? Following the laws. How many of you always follow the laws? Oh, we all follow the law. Really? Do you drive over 55 miles an hour on 465? Do you cross the street of University Boulevard only when it says walk? Because if you answered no to the last question or no to the first question, you break the law. So either you're saying, well, I know better. That gets into all kinds of issues, and maybe those are banal, stupid examples. But my point being, I hope is made, is this the relationship between knowledge and action. Whether we act according to what we know or not. And the humanist position, the position of the humanities, was that we need to focus on persuading people to do the good. And how do you do that? Also with examples. Where do examples come from? History, literature. That's what this is about. Now, this does not mean that a scholastic at the universities would say, well, no, it's not important to do the good. Of course they would say it's important to do the good. the issue is one of emphasis. And slowly but surely, there began to be movements to reform university curriculum to the point where we start finding the term Reformation being used as part of this educational reform of the university curriculum to introduce humanism. And it's only in the 15th century, later on in the 15th century, where we start having the lectures on poetry, on classical poetry, for example, lectures on classical literature, at first being allowed to be offered, but not part of, let's say, your degree requirements, and then more and more becoming part of the university curriculum itself. And so that also was the development in Wittenberg and in Erfurt to a degree, but in Wittenberg, which is a new university, or was a new university in 1502, it was an issue of we need to have a reformation of the curriculum. I'll be getting to that. Here I have the non-university origins of humanism, which I've already really addressed. And the new subjects, poetry, literature, history, and ethics, a focus on language. And to show the importance of this, Erasmus of Rotterdam, who's been called the Prince of the Humanists, also from the north, issued a new translation of the New Testament in 1516, referred to as the Novum Instrumentum, because the text of the scriptures was the Vulgate. Vulgata was the common translation, which had been done by St. Jerome in the 4th century. And since the 4th century, it had been the same received text of Jerome. And Erasmus said, Jerome was great, but yeah, I can do it better, based on Greek. So he issues a new translation. Here's just one example of the impact of this, because this was hugely controversial. The opening of the Gospel of John in Latin, in the Vulgate, St. Jerome's Latin, is in principio erat verbum. Now, verbum is a good Latin term meaning word. In the beginning was the word. In English, often we translate that, or use, not translate, but we use the uppercase W for that. In the beginning was the word, capital W-O-R-D. Just distinguish it from just the word, not the word of the Lord, but a word in a sentence. What is this word? We're talking about the word, okay? And that is verbal. There's metaphysical connotations to that. And that was a translation, the Latin translation of the Greek logos. What Erasmus said was, but in Greek, logos doesn't really mean that metaphysical word. It can. It really means more the spoken word, which there's a good Latin term for that, sermo, which is the basis of our word sermon. So Erasmus translated the opening of John's Gospel, in the beginning was the word, as in principio erat sermo. The spoken word, not the metaphysical word, the word, capital W. He related that to, he says, well, in the beginning, what did God do? In the beginning, God created. How did God create? Deus dixit. And God said, let there be light. It's the spoken word. Now just think about that a minute. The difference between the word, capital W, and the sermon, in the beginning was the spoken word, is huge. Now, Erasmus said there's theological reasons for this, there's textual reasons for it, and it's more accurate with the Greek. But that changed the entire understanding. And when Erasmus then ended up going on to translate the Christian Old Testament too, the issue in Isaiah, prophecy about a virgin who will bring forth a child. It's not a virgin; it just means a young woman. A virgin can't bring forth a child. It's a contradiction in terms. And so these kinds of translations were hugely controversial and were condemned. And so in terms of biblical scholarship, it was a major issue. Just think of today. I mean, new translations can be very controversial. Should we go back and use inclusive language and retranslate the Bible to use inclusive language? Because Latin and Greek can distinguish between the generic human being and male or female. All these kinds of issues. And that if you grow up with a particular translation of the Bible, changing that is controversial. That's what was going on here too. Now again, Erasmus was condemned, but it was based on his Greek scholarship, his textual scholarship, his humanist scholarship. And this approach to poetry, literature, ethics, and history, and the focus on language and classical models and classical texts, especially in the North, led to groups who started to study these things outside of the university and advocating for university reform. These were known as humanist circles or sodalitates, and the individual who was the professor of the Bible at Wittenberg, and we'll be hearing more about later on, Johannes Staupitz, who was a member of the Augustinian hermits and was Luther's kind of father figure, was the leader of one of these sodalitates. This is Sodalitas Staupitziana is what it was referred to of, where they would get together. It's like a book club in some ways. Get together and talk about these ideas, these concepts, how it relates to biblical texts, how it relates to preaching, how it relates to Christian doctrine and understanding and education. So this was developing. And we'll see that too, importantly, later on in France, because there were humanist reform circles also in France later on. And we'll see how that ties in. But this is when they really emerged in the later 15th century, north of the Alps and outside of the university, even though they were advocating for reform. Now, at Wittenberg, which was established again in 1502 and as a traditional university, but they did something, and they advocated, also with Luther advocating, for the need to reform the curriculum, also in terms of theology, and to have a professor of Greek. Because this whole approach to the Bible, to theological studies, Luther was open to. He was open to Erasmus, even though it's been shown that when Luther did his own translation, he basically based it not on Erasmus, but on the Vulgate. But that's another issue, which I may get back to at some point later on in a subsequent lecture. And so the university decided that they would do that they would bring in, establish a new professor of Greek. And in 1518, they hired Philip Melanchthon to be the new professor of Greek. Now, they wanted actually to get Johannes Reuchlin. Reuchlin was an old scholar at this time, a well-known humanist north of the Alps, also studied in Italy, was also very instrumental in the study of Hebrew, advocating for the Christian study of Hebrew. And Reuchlin said, I'm just too tired, I'm too old, but my nephew would be great. He's young, he's brilliant, a brilliant scholar. His name is Philip Schwarzerd. He studied at Tübingen and Heidelberg. And so Wittenberg hired Philip Schwarzerd as their new professor of Greek. He was, I think, 21 years old. I think he was born in 1497. So he was young and brash, and he comes and gives his inaugural lecture, and just completely won Luther over. Luther was just like, this guy is great, and his lecture was on the reform of studies. Now, the Melanchthon, he became known as because he said, if I'm going to be the professor of Greek as a humanist, I shouldn't keep my Greek or my German name, Schwarzerd, but I should put it into Greek. And what does Schwarzerd mean? It means black earth, Melanchthon. So he became known as Philip Melanchthon, as the Greek version of Schwarzerd. And Melanchthon we'll hear more about because he became Luther's right-hand man and centrally important for the Luther's Reformation. And on we go. Now, I have up here too Luther and Erasmus on free will, 1525, because there was a controversy breaking out between Erasmus and Luther. They were writing treatises back and forth kind of against each other, and Melanchthon had to kind of be an intermediary because Erasmus is like, what the heck is going on with this guy, this Luther guy? And Melanchthon had to say, okay, you know what? He's kind of crude, but kind of trying to look past that. Now, the reason I mention this is because this is often portrayed, this debate between Erasmus and Luther over the free will, as emblematic of Renaissance and late medieval theology, with Luther being the backward person. But if we look at Luther's texts, he knew the classical tradition, I'm not going to say as well as Erasmus, but he certainly knew what he was doing, even if his style was still more traditional. So the question has been, was then Luther a humanist? He certainly supported Melanchthon and advocated for humanist reformation of the university. He showed that he could, stand up to the Prince of the Humanists, even if the style was very different. And it's been a big debate. And one German scholar said, without humanism, there would have been no Reformation. That's not quite the same as saying that Luther was a humanist. But was he a humanist? Well, technically, no. He did, though, lecture on Aristotle's physics. But so that has always been. He wanted to lecture on Aristotle's ethics. He never got around to it. So in one sense, he was not technically a teacher of the humanities. So we can't say that he was a humanist the same way we can't say that Melanchthon was. Did he use humanist models? Did he use the influence of humanism? And certainly he did. Did he use historical concepts? Yes, he did. And almost in some ways, we can see the Reformation as being one of the first major movements that used historical criticism as a basis of showing how the traditional approach was wrong historically. Friedrich Nietzsche, in the 19th century, referred to history as the hammer blow of historical insight and truth. Then it would break apart everything. And going back to the 18th century, Johann Simler wrote that the true critique of church doctrine and dogma is history. So this became really a point with the Reformation. The question we'll see later is, did Luther understand enough of the history to do it effectively? But that's another issue that we'll get to when we get there. So the question of whether Luther was a humanist has been debated and gone back and forth. And I'm not going to sit here and say he was or he wasn't, except to say that he was not a humanist as so often thought. And just because he is critical of the institution, as were humanists, as were other scholastics, as were a lot of people in this period of the 14th, 15th, on into the early 16th century, that doesn't make him a humanist. That doesn't mean that he was influenced by humanism. He was to a degree as anyone who was involved in education at the time was. So that is kind of the context, and I want to present it that way, not as to say, yes, he was, and therefore, but really to say, okay, this was one of the developments at the time that Luther was a part of that was a contributing factor to, number one, this late medieval crisis, because it was a crisis of education. This is the last slide here. The unsuitability of educational structures. When all of a sudden it's like the traditional education was not serving its purpose. What do we do about it? Do we change it? How so? Just think about some of the debates over curriculum today to see about the controversial aspects of this in terms of a crisis. Okay, maybe that is too strong of a word. If it were just the issue of the educational structures and curricula, but combined with everything else, and this call for the reformation of the universities, the reformation of studies, was one contributing factor of this reformation of the late Middle Ages. And it was this call for the reformation of the educational structures was based on humanism, the humanist approach, bringing in the humanities officially as part of the curriculum. Now, was it a forcing of change? Well, it got to be that way because it was all based on having to decree and change university policies. And to what end? To what purpose? That's difficult to say. Was it a change just to be something new? Was it a change for the better, for the worse? It certainly contributed to this concept of scholastics being backwards and wrong, which was not a help, because there were no more backwards and wrong than were some of the humanists. But scholasticism became contrasted with humanism as a stodgy, outdated, outmolded, inappropriate educational approach. And that's caused all kinds of problems, because Luther was very much a scholastic, even if he didn't really have the educational background to compete with the 14th century scholastics. That was the basis of his training. And so it really does a disservice to understanding what was going on in Italy. It's even been argued that scholasticism and humanism developed together in Italy. Scholasticism as a method, which we'll be talking more about as we go, especially as it relates to theology. You'll be reading Luther's disputation against scholastic theology, which was very much a scholastic approach. But how do we determine and evaluate to what purpose and what end? The idea was to make things better. And that if we can go back and look at classical models of literature, of language, of thought, that then would include going back to looking at classical models of Christianity. Now, it's not that that had ever been ignored. The entire kind of monastic tradition, including the Mendicants, in some ways were all based on the original apostolic community of Acts. The Augustinian rule is based on Acts 4, 31 through 33, I think it is. Having everything in common, distributing each according to need. So it's not that that was not known or ignored. The question was then, how do we make that effective in our world today? So it's not that everything good was associated with the Renaissance and humanism, and everything bad was associated with scholasticism and the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, even worse, which is just absolutely ahistorical, the concept. It's far more complex than that. And seeing how it all worked together was far more complex than that. And even later on, as we go into the later 16th century and onto the 17th century, we have developing what ended up being called neo-scholasticism, which was again seen very much as a positive, because of the need to be logically precise and argue against what was considered to be false doctrine, whatever position you were in. And so we have to somehow realize that logic and truth has to be joined with the good and persuasion and not one or the other in some ways. Now that's putting it in far more broad terms, but this is kind of trying to portray the educational context in which this desire for reformation, not only in terms of the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, of which humanism was very much a part, and the Renaissance was very much a part, but also then to understand its further development as we move into the 16th century, to understand the context of Luther and what was going on and how this was all possible to begin with, what was going on and what was to be happening in the 16th century when we get there and beyond. And humanism and the humanities was part of that, even if not as previously portrayed. Now, that's in a nutshell what I wanted to say about the Renaissance and humanism. It is important for understanding our period, the developments were going on, but to realize that it was part of the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, not against it, and contributed to the emergence of modernity in the course of the 16th century. But we'll be seeing more how that plays out in the lectures hereafter. So that's what I have to say about the Renaissance and humanism for now. Again, if I am going to be teaching it in the fall, then you want to hear more. We'll have a lot of fun, I think, in History B 353, the Renaissance. So we'll go from there. Anyway, thank you so much, and I will be back. Bye-bye.